Good morning, everyone. My name is Raj Patil. I'm a board member with TiE DC, and the topic of our panel discussion is going to be big data, data analytics. I know the theme of the conference is about innovation, and my fellow panelists, that is Julie Henderson from IBM. We have Mark Abrams from Harmonia, and we have Dom Keating, who joined us remotely. He's with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. So just to let you know the innovation aspects, IBM tops the list of the companies that has the highest number of innovation patents in the world. I think IBM has 150,000 patents or so. So talk about innovation, and they've been on the top list for the last 28 years. And then, of course, the patents are granted by the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And Dom, who's joined here remotely, is the head of the IP attaché program, which is the intellectual property program that manages all of the IP attaches all over the world, including India, China, Europe. And Dom actually worked in India before at the U.S. Embassy, embassy from 2006 to 2010. And he's also an award winner, a silver medalist with the Department of Commerce from the Secretary of Commerce. So, and then Mark Abrams is the Chief Technology Officer with Harmonia. So with that, please join me in welcoming our panelists here. Julie is a partner at IBM. She heads the IBM's entire Department of Commerce program. Before IBM, Julie served in the government as the Assistant Undersecretary of Policy and Planning with the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs. And she's also worked with Senator Kerry from Nebraska and also with the Department of Transportation. So with that, I'd like to ask my panelists to maybe just talk about your brief backgrounds, and then we'll jump into the discussion. So we'll start with you, Julie, first, please.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Wanted to share how nice it was to actually get out of the house and come see people in person. And I literally dusted off these shoes. The last thing I did before I walked out the door, because they have not been worn now in over 2 years. So thank you for the need to do that. My background is really both in government policy and management as well as in the private sector. And where I thrive is that intersection between the two. So my work experience and training, both public policy and business administration. And have gone in and out of government and the private sector over the last 25 years, and came back to IBM about a year ago, as Raj mentioned, to lead the commerce account for our services unit.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. Mark, you want to talk about your background?
Okay, so I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Harmonia, and my background at Harmonia has been to work with primarily in terms of data analytics and big data with Defense Department agencies. So I'll talk about some examples, but it'll by necessity have to be a little bit broad, and then also work with certain agencies like the Department of Agriculture, where we've had to do a lot of data management. I myself, before that, used to be a professor in computer science at Virginia Tech, and then I was also a visiting scientist at IBM.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Dom, if you can tell us a little bit about your background, that'll be great.
Sure. Thanks, Raj. Although I'm sorry that I wasn't able to join you in person today, it's enjoyable to interact with people even remotely. So for me, because I'm here working from home, but I have been with USPTO for a number of years in different roles. As you mentioned, Raj, I was previously IP attaché in New Delhi, and I opened that office and worked there for 4 years. I also was IP attaché in Geneva, helping to, participating in a negotiation with really the TRIPS agreement, which is an intellectual property related agreement at the World Trade Organization. And I've, served as a patent examiner and other legal and technical roles within the agency. The attaché program is really, I think, a program that is well suited for this audience because it helps small businesses. It also focuses on innovation, and it utilizes a lot of data. So I'm looking forward to our discussion today.
Awesome. Thank you, Dom. So we'll start with Julie here. You've worked in the public sector as well as now you're a thought leader at IBM. So on a high level, if you can tell us what are the trends that you're seeing in terms of data science or use of data by government agencies, and how has that really impacted, how government is operating, whether it's efficiencies or how it's supporting the mission in a better way?
Yeah. So ultimately, using data is about making better decisions. And whether it's, my bias or my experience, I always couple the use of data with the improved management of government organizations. And so, thinking back to 1993, and I'm going to date myself here, in terms of the Government Performance and Results Act, that created a whole new set of drivers and requirements for agencies to measure performance, right? And then we have the CFO Act in 1996, which emphasized clean audit opinions. And so with these mandates, as well as some infusion of private sector practices, it really established the need for collecting data. Started out in a very manual process, right, in the 90s, and even putting the data into the internet tools in the early 2000s. But as the requirements and the expectations for managing government agencies has matured over the last 25 years, it's created a whole new set, right, of needs and expectations for the data, and both in terms of collecting and analyzing. So, when I served at VA under President Obama, there were still plenty of spreadsheets that were being used to collect data from just a vastly distributed and huge organization all across the country and in the U.S. territories. So in thinking about how these things evolve and change over time, again, I can't decouple those two from what I've observed and also what I've experienced and been responsible for in my career, both public and private sector. But, it was 12 to 15 years ago where we were still trying to move things out of spreadsheets, right, into more of the automated systems, particularly on the finance side, so that there could be more of a snapshot of financial health, whether that would be budget, planned to actual figures, so that it wouldn't just be looked at the end of a fiscal year once the books were closed, in that respect. And then, what we've seen in the last couple of years is obviously the automation, right? Again, as expectations and requirements become higher for how government performs, what they report, the types of decisions that leaders and managers use, come to find out that, just having systems and data warehouses isn't enough. So how do things evolve in terms of the intelligent automation and applying the AI so that the data is real time? It's not just predictive, but that those data can be used to make decisions, complex and simple, over time. So a full life cycle, I would say,
Right.
in terms of how things have evolved and matured since the mid-90s.
Absolutely. I think 5 years ago, if we met at this conference, there was no such term as a chief data officer.
Yeah.
And today it's just as important as a CIO and a CTO at a federal government agency. So, yeah, I think it's evolving, as you said, Julie. I agree with that. Dom, I think next question for you is, I'd like to know more about the IP attaché program. I don't think most of the audience and TiE groups are involved with the CIO, CTO groups, but maybe you can elaborate more what the IP attaché program is at the Patent Office.
Sure. Thank you, Raj, for that question. The IP attaché program, as I mentioned, it helps U.S. stakeholders, but it does that primarily by advocating with foreign governments to improve intellectual property systems. It also provides helpful information to stakeholders. We operate all around the world. We've got an attaché in Brazil covering the eastern side of South America. We've got one in Lima, Peru, covering the western side of South America. We've got two in Geneva, one at the U.S. mission to the World Trade Organization and one at the U.S. mission to the UN organizations. And then in Brussels, we have an attaché covering all of the European Union and the rest of Europe. In Kiev, Ukraine, we have an attaché covering all of Central Eurasia. And then further to the east, we have an attaché in Abu Dhabi covering all the Middle East and North Africa, one in New Delhi covering all of South Asia, one in Bangkok covering all the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, so the the ASEAN region, a pretty big region. And then 3 attachés focused just on China, one in Beijing, one in Guangzhou, and one in Shanghai. And that's because of the importance of intellectual property issues in China. But circling back to what the attachés do, in terms of their advocacy, they directly advocate. That's their primary means of advocating, where they sit down with host governments and explain how intellectual property systems can be improved and how that would be beneficial to the host government. They also do indirect advocacy through training and public awareness programs. And so that's in a nutshell what the program does. And I do think that, well, we'll get into, I think later, have an opportunity to talk about how we utilize data, but the program is certainly a valuable resource to the folks who are here today.
Great. Thank you, Dom. Yeah, U.S. Patent and Trademark Office receives, I think, 600,000 patent applications every year. And you can imagine the data that is generated and the data analytics or the patent analytics that go behind it. So huge opportunity for those of you who are interested in AI, ML, machine learning programs. So that's a big, great customer to have. But I'm going to move on to with Mark, question about, being a CTO. And data science, I think, is still a very fluid area. As you know, there's questions about data governance. There are no NIST standards. There's no standard protocols, how you build your models, or even data cleansing or labeling of data. And this is what happened early on when the internet initially started, right, 25, 30 years ago. So the question for you, Mark, is how would you define, data science or data analytics is, you can define your own term and say, that this is what data science means. But maybe from your perspective, Mark, if you can tell us from a federal or the public sector side, what does data science, data analytics, how would you describe it?
So I'll give an answer to that based on some of the customers that we have. If we look on the civilian side in USDA, we have had the opportunity to support FPAC there for, I think, going on the 7th year to provide a lot of the curation methods of data to build an enterprise data warehouse and come up with a true enterprise understanding, of a producer and FPAC and what are all the associated places where they've ever touched any part of USDA in their interactions, and to do that historically, looking back over decades as well. And the issue there, I think, is twofold. One, to be able to use analytics means to understand how to get data from numerous sources, be able to identify the curation processes for that, the governance, and bring it into a common warehouse, but then also a workforce transformation, because people are used to using reports, they're used to reporting on certain cycles depending on regulatory requirements. And of course, the technology opens up a lot of possibilities to do visualization, to be able to have updates on a daily basis of what's going on. And that transformation for the way people work often means that the technology is ahead in terms of what people can do. The other aspect of it is it's not so much of a security issue, but an issue of, when you commingle and bring data together in enterprise form, it lets people make insights that they didn't have before, but due to some regulations, of course, sometimes that creates situations where the data is exposed or can be, kind of reverse engineered in a way that hadn't been possible before, and that consideration needs to be there. On the defense side, the real push there has been how to make decisions in very, very short time stress pressure time frame, but access enormous amounts of data for them to be able to do. And that means that if you're going to use AI or ML or other methods, the time frame in which they need to work extremely short, and it makes a real computational problem for them too. And then the other aspect of it is I think in DoD is data discovery. There are many agencies that have data within DoD. If a mission's being performed, where is that located? It may be in other sources that you're not aware of. And then the last trend there that we found is working with other nations in a multinational setting. Everybody owns their data. How do they share that data in a way where they have a certain level of trust, but not complete trust?
Great, thank you. So I guess next question is for Julie. The process for data analytics is pretty well established, right? You have data ingestion, you process, you analyze, then you use graphic user interface, tools like Tableau or something, and then you come up with predictive analytics, right, or trends. But I think what I'm seeing now, this new term called data intelligence, right? That's what you're really getting in. And question for Julie, again, as a thought leader at IBM, or in the previous work, how did you use data intelligence to make business decisions?
Yep. So, at the risk of giving away my secret sauce, given that there are folks in this room who I likely compete with in terms of contract opportunities, I use in my current role, right, which is leading the profit and loss unit for the Department of Commerce, I use a combination of public and private sources, quantitative and qualitative. And what I start with is budget data, right? Both in terms of what's in a budget request for the coming fiscal year, and then also the backwards look, right? What's available in spending.gov to do the analysis of kind of the big picture, which organizations have money, which organizations can commingle funds based on budget and appropriations accounts. Some of this is right based on my experience, and I know how to navigate that, but have found that it's been very useful. And then also going into the usaspending.gov data in more detail and getting a sense of what's the concentration of companies that are serving a particular organization, or is it dispersed? What does that mean in terms of market analysis and opportunities? And then I layer over the qualitative data, right? Some that I do myself in terms of networking and talking with folks, certainly talking with clients, and then also the third party. Right, other observations from independent analysts who are analyzing the market, and then also people who I trust within my network who may be turning up some nuggets, as I like to say, and applying those too, so that then I come up with my priorities in a world of limited resources, how I actually and what I actually pursue in a given fiscal year.
Excellent. Thank you, Julie. I think you just formed, everybody attending here is going to be your partner now,
yes.
not a competitor, right? So I think we'll move on to a question for Dom here with regards to, the micro and macro level data that, you have to collect. And of course, there are implications of policy, when you're dealing with overseas, with IP that is US patent-based IP. So you can talk about, how do you use that micro level data that you collect globally in your business decisions.
Okay. Well, if you don't mind, maybe I'll start by making a couple points about macro data and then transitioning into some of the micro.
Sure.
There are several sources of macro data that are available to us, and we benefit from utilizing. One is the one that I prefer is a report that's put out and updated from time to time between USPTO and the Economic and Statistics Association organization, and this report talks about the big picture importance of intellectual property to the U.S. economy. It contains statistics like 45 million American jobs are related to included in the IP-intensive industries. $6 trillion of the TiE being of value in the IP-intensive industries, which is more than a third, or at least at the time of the last study that I read, was more than a third of the U.S. economy. So when we read stats like that, it helps us to know, to think about how much we're investing and in which countries, or at least it starts to kind of give us the big picture of how much this is worth to us as an agency. The International IP Advocacy, for example. Other sources of information, we look at, there's a report that's put out by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office each year called the Special 301 Report, and it's really a compilation of data that comes in from different businesses and associations around the world, really. A lot of them are American, but it's about where the intellectual property issues are and sort of the magnitude of the problems. So that's valuable to us. There are other reports, like the Business Software Alliance has a report that they put out from time to time that talks about business piracy software in different jurisdictions of the world. And that's helpful for us to see where some of the problems lie. And that helps us to make decisions around where to place attachés and which types of resources we need in which markets. So at the micro level, we collect data, related to a number of the activities that we do, and this could be the number of stakeholders that we help, the number of government officials that we meet, the number of training programs we conduct, and the number of participants, et cetera. And this data comes back, and we compile it all into Tableau graphics. So we've got bar charts and pie charts and bar graphs and other visuals to help us to understand how we're doing and how that compares against previous years, and to know what we need to do in terms of additional resources sometimes. And sometimes it helps us to understand which stakeholders we're reaching and which target audiences we haven't reached yet, so that we can be engaged with the broader group of U.S. stakeholders. So that's an overview, Raj, of the micro and macro data that we use.
Awesome. Okay, thank you. I think I'm going to ask Mark to wear his Chief Information Security Officer's hat here, because starting to deal with big data. Of course, trust, privacy, and security are on the forefront. You're dealing with PII data, or you have to deal with HIPAA compliance, FISMA compliance, all these FedRAMPs, we talked about yesterday. I think there was a session yesterday Manish talked about regarding data governance, right? I mean, there's no. So how do you we can comment on the cybersecurity aspects of managing this data?
Yeah, so actually we've got, again, within DoD, growing base of clients that are looking at using distributed ledger methods. And one of the reasons why is because it goes back to the earlier thing I said, the US collaborates with other nations and shares data. And so, a distributed ledger can be a way to help between parties that aren't necessarily trusting of each other, especially if they're in an international situation with that too. So, I think some of the things that are important are access control and having that in an immutable form for that, and distributed ledgers can do that too. And then I think another thing that's been touched on in a few panels is just the identity management also. How do you really know who you're sharing with? Agencies have PIV cards and DoD has CAC cards, and so you can use that, but beyond that, what do you do after that? And so the emerging areas there, I think, are also ones that are important too. The other thing is just in terms of, we're all familiar with access control lists and methods like that have been around for years for use of data, but when data is combined, how do you identify what the audience should be for that as well? So that's another aspect of it too. So I think the methods that are used with that too also have to be looked at from the standpoint of people potentially reverse engineering results that come out too. When data is distributed with that and it's been redacted in some form from government agencies, another issue that exists there is it possible to get an idea of what was removed from looking at the data? So, I mean, one way to think about that is in the cyber domain, we think about defending our systems, and then other entities are attacking those systems, and we have to keep outsmarting that. I think the same thing exists in terms of data that's released by government agencies. We'll try to redact it, but then people on the other side, excuse me, are data scientists too just as smart, so they may be use methods to try to figure out what it is that wasn't released and make inferences about that.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Julie, I'm going to move on in terms of the partnering aspects and working with IBM, right? We have a number of small companies, 8A firms that are just starting and aspirational journeys, whether working with IBM as a subcontractor or being a small business set-asides, or can IBM partner as a subcontractor? So maybe you can give some advice to some of our TiE members as to how best ways of working as a small business with IBM.
Yes, great question. So my recommendation is that you remember and carry out the 2 Ps, which is be persistent and be patient. So persistence means don't just rely on email, and don't just rely on sharing your capabilities statement, right? There's a lot of noise that we all face every day. I refer to my email inbox as the Bermuda Triangle. So be more assertive, set a time to talk with someone or just call them and leave a message, right? And ask for a call. Just don't rely on only the passive methods of communication because it's really hard to break through. It's also important in terms of persistence to be registered with like the official, kind of small business office or team within a large company that makes you real, right? I use real in quotes, so to speak. And what that does is add credibility so that when you interact with business leaders in that firm, they can say, hey, are they registered with us? Or vice versa. If one of the business leaders is looking for a small business partner, they can turn to their internal small business office and say, hey, do you have any 8As with these capabilities with experience at Department of Energy, for example? And that office will run a data query, right? And give you at least a universe to start with. So you want to make sure that you're covering all the bases and again, being persistent there. And then the patience piece. Don't wait to build these relationships until you know that an opportunity is coming out or it's on the street, right? You really need to play the long game. So, learn where these big companies are that maybe you want to be in terms of organizationally or the capabilities that might be complementary to what you do. Identify who's leading, who are some of the business leaders, and again, be assertive, reach out to them, build those relationships long before you need them. The other piece of patience is knowing that people in the chairs move, right? At big companies, probably more so than small. So someone you may have built a relationship with as the Department of Energy lead for 2 years may move on to a different role within the same company. Just be sure that that person does a handoff, right? So that you have a warm introduction to their successor and starting all over and trying to get someone's attention. And the last thing I'll say is just, be smart about, again, where your capabilities complement the big companies, not necessarily compete, but also know that where you have similar capabilities to one of the big firms can also be very strategic for the big firms in thinking about switching out some of the rates, right? And when the pricing analysis and the price to win effort comes into play, having more than one option, meaning more than one teaming partner on the team that can perform similar work but at different rates gives the prime a lot of flexibility that they often need in order to compete for the work.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie.
Sure.
So she said, don't send me emails, call my cell phone. So that's the message I got.
Raj calls me, so he can say that.
So I think I'm going to question for Dom. We had Keith yesterday from the State Department talked about data sharing and the challenges even within the department, right? But I think Dom, this next question is for you. Patent Office under the preview of Department of Commerce, with the intent of increasing our export-imports, working abroad. So question is, how do you manage the interworkings of the government? Because you have to deal with Department of Justice. Dom has to deal with State Department when it comes. So maybe you can give us some how does the intergovernment data share or communication protocols, how do you work on those?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question, Raj. So there's a lot of collaboration that goes on within the government. Some people would say not enough, but I think when we look more closely at the IP attaché program, you'll see a lot of collaboration going on between the attachés, but more importantly, between the attachés and other agencies. And it starts with, we have a team of specialized attorneys back in USPTO headquarters who have knowledge specific to countries and regions, knowledge of intellectual property of those countries and regions. And these are patent attorneys, trademark attorneys, and copyright attorneys, even enforcement attorneys, all working with the attachés to provide additional resources that are sometimes not visible. And at the embassy, there are a lot of different agencies, like you mentioned, Raj. You've got DOJ, and they have the intellectual property law enforcement coordinators. We've got U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service with their commercial officers. We've got the State Department economic officers, et cetera. And all the attachés gather all these people together on a regular basis to talk about the issues and to share information. But also the attachés provide reports back to headquarters, often on a daily basis. And this is often because intellectual property in most countries tends not to be sensitive. I mean, we're very transparent. We know, everyone knows what we're up to. We're sending it by email, so it's coming back. There can be cables, and that's mostly done by other agencies, but we send it back by email, and it goes back to those teams in USPTO headquarters, but also to all the other federal agencies, so everybody knows what's going on. And then when it comes time for a big picture policy change, that's the federal agencies in Washington getting together to talk. And it's my colleagues, sometimes myself, getting together with other agencies to hash that out. I think that's a brief overview. I know we don't have a lot of time, so I won't dive into it any deeper.
Okay. No, bro, that's great.
Thanks.
Well, I think, we can simply appreciate the role they have to play, right? On the, we always say, well, it's the government's problem, but I think that interagency coordinations and all of these challenges and the policy implications while still, delivering the value to the citizens, right? That's still the, but again, appreciate all the great efforts you guys put in. I'll ask my last question here before we open up for audience questions. This would be with Mark. Question about exponential growth of data. Everybody came in today, we used the Clear app, and I think, I drove today, used my GPS, and so you can just imagine the volume of data that is being created, right? Exponential, period. And, with the government agencies, so any comments on managing this data? And then it gets into this, GDPR issues. I know State of California has now implemented some of the policies of GDPR, and that's having impact with small businesses and technology firms. So maybe you can comment on those aspects.
Yeah, so I'll make two comments on the exponential size. One has to do with managing the understanding of the data itself as it scales, and then the second is processing the data too, because that really becomes an issue. In terms of understanding the data, it grows exponentially either because there's a lot of instances, it's something like the census and there's hundreds of millions of people that are replying, or it grows exponentially because you've got multiple data sources within an agency or across agencies or across collection sources, and that's combined. In that second case like that, that can create kind of a Tower of Babel situation. And we've got several clients which are trying to figure out, now that they've got different sources, how do they more effectively find the relationships between the data, but it's a scale problem. You've got too many parts of of a large government agency that are producing data. They've had their own schemas with that. How do you understand how to relate something like a date or a name or other aspects when they mean something different in all the data sources? And there is a human process that people go through in terms of data governance to help with that, or building models. So a technology area is what can be done with more automated means of being able to do that, or to help machine understanding, without necessarily having a person involved. Then on the other side, once the data is there and it's available, the problem is processing. So the processing part of it, the problem is, how do you grow algorithms that you develop to be able to work at large scale? And it can be extremely hard to do that. Algorithms that work on 1 million documents, if somebody presents you in an agency with, now we have 100 million documents, and you're doing text analysis with those, some things parallelize and some things don't parallelize very well. So my point about that is that at the early stages of a project, if you aren't really careful in choosing the types of algorithms to use in that, you'll get into a lot of difficulties when you go later to get into production with that. Or if this becomes popular and it's used with other agencies or used with other countries as well. So the computation aspects of it, low-hanging fruit kind of thing is attractive at the beginning, but it can create problems in the long term in trying to find methods that really scale with the massive size of what agencies have.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Mark. I think, and then there was a discussion yesterday about the data quality and, the domino effect of data bias and things like that. So as this exponential data is growing, I think on the back end, what is happening is AI, ML output is not, your probability of accuracy is just going down, right? I mean, only from the human standpoint, I would say. So anyways, with that, I'll open up. Please, Looks like we have a question back there. Go ahead, Mike.
Thank you, Raj. Wonderful panel. Julie, I really like your idea of 2 Ps, patience and persistence.
Thanks.
But if you're very persistent, you may come across obnoxious. If you're very patient, you may come across lack of interest.
Yes.
So do you have some success story you can elaborate where this actually worked for the small business?
Yeah, great question. And you know, some of the fit really depends on your target's personality, right? So, and there is a fine line between persistence and obnoxious. So, you know, I mean, one check-in once a week, I think is persistent. More than once a week, you would, like, in my preferences, I would start getting annoyed. But the other thing that you may want to do is if you know someone also in the company who's not the target, right? So let's say you happen to know one of my colleagues or one of our consultants who delivers on site at a project. Having them send me a note, you know, or the internal messaging, we use Slack, and just say, hey, you've got a note in your inbox, right? To just kind of re-emphasize. And that signals that the person who's trying to reach you is really putting forth, you know, some thoughtful effort to try to reach you. And that tends to be more well received than just the blanket, you know, I'm going to call you every 48 hours until I hear back. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead.
Great job, panel. Appreciate some of the openness. I'm going to go specifically to you, Dom. Nice to talk about bar charts and pie charts and emails, but specifically in very crucial technologies between US and Australia relating to next generation batteries that we're involved in. Our biggest concern is some of the Chinese, you'll be very well aware, who are either duplicating the same thing or getting access to some of our data and analyzing it further and working through that. What can our attaches do to make sure that our intellectual property is protected in that case?
Great question. And I think the one key issue that arises with the scenario that you presented is has to do with trade secrets. And at least from our perspective, I'm sure from an IT perspective, you can look at encryption and security of the data itself. But from an intellectual property perspective, it could be that you need to make sure that and these two issues do relate, that you're taking adequate steps to protect your trade secrets so that if you do have to go to court to get an injunction based on theft of trade secrets, that you've taken the appropriate steps ahead of time. So if you're talking about trade secret theft or potential trade secret theft by China, it might be helpful to talk to our IP attaches, maybe our IP attaché based in Beijing, about the new trade secret law and what it looks like and how enforceable its provisions are. Also to find out what steps you'd need to take to be able to enforce those rights in China, should you run into a problem like you anticipate. I think likewise, I mean, you would probably want to think about on the Australia side, you know, ensuring that your partners manage the data with adequate precautions so that it won't be lost as well and so that it would be enforceable. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
There's one more question here.
Question to all the 3 panelists. I know the government agencies are all over the spectrum in terms of use of AI and ML. But if you were to think of sort of one application that your customer agency would like to use, or your PTO, you would like to apply AI ML to, what would that be?
So the one area that we are pouring the most resources into right now is around patent examination. And that, I think the area that's probably the lowest hanging fruit as a former patent examiner would seem to be conducting searches, because that, you know, could be run and the patent examiner would ultimately be able to look at it and say, this is a great search, or, you know, you're missing something here. And then, you know, the machine learning could go back and improve based on the feedback that's received. there's, when it gets into the broader patent examination process, and I'm not an expert on on AI at all, but I'm sure there are many more challenges because there are issues that have to be decided that are often based on judicial decisions. So that gets a little bit more complicated. But I think, immediately, searching patents, searching trademarks, it could be much more straightforward.
I'll add to what Dom said. So in my experience, USPTO is one of the leading agencies to apply AI and ML technologies, and they're doing it mostly in like the examination pipeline. And what they're trying to do is automate, right, these fast searches in the beginning of the process for their examiners. I think they're also working toward making that available to the public for people who file patents directly, or agents who do it on their behalf, such as a patent attorney in private practice, or working in-house at a firm. And then the human role, the human capital and the expertise, to Dom's point, is really applying that judgment based on previous decisions, or the knowledge and expertise that particular examiner has built up over time and in a certain niche. But we're seeing USPTO be out ahead of that. VA is also doing it, related to claims processing and their benefits administration. Intractable problem for decades. And within the last 2 years, using intelligent automated processing and AI, they have been able to reduce the backlog, and now it takes, instead of 3 weeks to process a piece of mail or an initial claim, it takes 1 day. Yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Okay, Raj, this is Sumit Luthran, great panel, and thank you everyone for the great inputs. So my question is related more, building on what Ashok just said about AI, and Julie, something that you mentioned earlier. So in any organization where you want to deploy useful AI, not only do you need a technology and the ability, your algorithms, however you're looking at the technology, but also understanding the business and being able to build the rules. So in that context, then, how does a small business who maybe has an understanding of a specific organization or business rules because they've worked in the mission areas or supported a particular customer for a while, how would that company then reach out to IBM or other large organizations and be persistent and sending emails and calling? Because wouldn't it be then better for that company to work with another large company who's more responsive, right? So so there's a technical aspect, and I understand your answer from if it was a commodity service that IBM was going to buy.
Right.
But if you're going to buy as a part of our overall team, a service that's more complicated, right? So it helps IBM succeed. How would that company engage with a company like yours or any other large company?
Yep. So it will take a lot of research on behalf, right, or on the part of the small business or kind of the outside organization that's trying to reach in and tap into the assets and the capabilities that the large organization has. If that company that's wishing to partner with a big company like IBM can clearly articulate their knowledge, let's say, of a process or a sub-process and a particular sub-agency where that large company does not have a presence, right? You're immediately demonstrating the value that you bring because you have the knowledge of the process, you understand, the management, where the landmines are, the personalities of leaders, what their strategic priorities are, right? And that's invaluable. And even big companies can't get that everywhere that they need, right? And by doing that, you're also starting to kind of carve out a unique role, right? Based on, again, the value that a company brings, a smaller company brings, and what a large company like IBM can do. And so then it becomes more of a cooperative and a collaboration right out of the gate, right? And that big company can, again, clearly identify what you bring in terms of that process knowledge, the business knowledge, and the relationships with the personality. It's much easier for them to say yes, right? And let's explore this together. But again, the onus is on you to do the research, like what would be of interest, right, to a big company. Maybe there's a large solicitation that's coming out and you're trying to get out in front of it and you want to partner with a certain company, so packaging it that way. But again, clearly articulating what it is that you know about the business processes, what you see their challenges are, and then what you know in terms of the leadership and their priorities can be a big one. Sure.
Great. Thank you, Julie. So on behalf of TiE DC, I want to thank all of you for attending this panel discussions. I want to thank our panelists here. Dom, I know you're not here, but we'll make sure we send you a token of appreciation
Yes.
at your home address.
Yes.
And with that, I think we'll have a 45-minute lunch break. So thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
everybody.
Okay.